think that we are pretty average when it comes to understanding how to work with emotions. And I say that like I work in some of the most alpha competitive environments in the world and pretty freaking average.
When I think about the external thing, I chat with high performers in the podcast or, some of the best athletes in the world all the time. And that thing is quite tangible for them. It's like you say, it's a championship. It's a Tour de France title. It's an Olympic gold medal.
You start with this dream about how you want to live your life, the feelings that come with it. You start with the dream. And then you figure out
when we peel it back to our everyday Joes and Janes, I call them, someone that's balancing conflicting demands on their time, work, family, maybe a side hustle, and they're still trying to prioritize health. Getting that thing, that's a little bit more of an abstract concept.
They revisit the dream. And that's all I'm suggesting in this conversation is go back and revisit what is the feeling that you want to have more often in your life, and then design your life for that.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Anthony. I'm a former lawyer turned cyclist turned podcast host who's based in Ireland. My goal with this channel is to introduce you to the people and to the ideas to help you optimize your health, your happiness, and your longevity. Today we have an episode that you absolutely cannot afford to miss. We're delving into a topic that silently impacts each and every one of us. Our internal monologue and how it is stopping us from reaching our full and true potential. Now, to help us unpack this subject, I had the honour of speaking with Dr. Michael Gervais, a high-performance psychologist who's worked with some of the most elite athletes, CEOs and artists in the world. He's the man behind the Finding Mastery podcast and has leveled up the greatest athletes in the world, from his work in the NFL with the Seattle Seahawks to the best-known UFC fighters and even US Tier 1 military operators. This guy knows what it takes to perform at the pinnacle of human ability. Dr. Gervais is a published peer-reviewed author, but he isn't just about the theory. He's about actionable insights. He's been featured in every high-profile news outlet around the world, including NBC, ESPN, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. In today's episode, we discuss the internal narratives that hold us back, the power of self-talk, and the practical strategies to revamp our internal dialogue for a healthier, happier, and more fulfilling life. So make sure you stick around until the end of the episode, because Dr. Gervais is going to give us one simple action that you can take right after the episode to kickstart your journey towards consistent motivation and peak performance. Trust me, you really don't want to miss this one. Before I jump into the show, I do have one small favour to ask. Can you please take 1 second just to hit the subscribe button, as still around 90% of the viewers watching the channel haven't subscribed. And when you subscribe, the channel gets bigger. When the channel gets bigger, we can attract bigger and bigger guests. So it's win-win all around. This is the Roadman Cycling Podcast. And now, dear friends, it's Dr. Michael Gervais. Michael, welcome to the Roadmat Podcast.
Anthony, it's great to be here.
I want to start off. Many of our listeners struggle with motivating themselves consistently. So they're bombarded with information, this podcast and others, and they know how to recapture their health. They know how to recapture their happiness. They know the pathway they should be taking, but they can't seem to get out of their own way to take that path. Why do we see this disconnect? Why is it so common?
I love the question. And it's not an easy one to just say, oh, here, let me tell you the one thing or the 7 steps. I don't think when it comes to high performance, there's no hacks, there's no tricks, there's no tips, there's no shortcuts. So this grounded question about motivation, I think, is right on the money. So maybe what we can do is we can just pull back a little bit, make sure we're talking about the same thing. And so motivation is this basic drive to go do something. And when you study that concept from a evolutionary perspective, there's no such thing as a motivation, like not being driven to something, because survival is such a strong driver for us. Our brain and our body is optimized to solve for something. And for the most part, it's survival. So if we are talking in this conversation about optimization, we're talking about high performance, not necessarily survival, then it's a bit of a different conversation. So I just want to ground it to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, which is the conversation of high performance. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the conversation of high performance.
Okay. Yeah. So when it comes to motivation, and we think about internal versus external motivation, we can also think about internal versus external rewards. And so let me just kind of frame it one more time, and then I'll drive into what I think is an important unlock for folks. So, because depending on the type of motivation depends on the best tool to be able to unlock that drive. There's internal, external, and exactly what it sounds like. Internally driven people, they don't need alarm bells. They don't need people tapping their shoulder. They don't need prodding. They don't need people checking up on them. They are driven from this internal mechanism to go explore, to go figure something out. And then if you're internally driven, you're going to have an easier time staying the course because it's coming from within, meaning that you love figuring shit out, period. The other is external. So you're chasing something, a reward, some sort of validation, something from the outside of you that fuels the required drive to keep going. So obviously you can see from the setup, this is why psychologists have been so attracted to at least illuminating the idea of internal motivation as opposed to the external rewards that people often find valuable. Now, it's not that simple, though. What I found by working with the best in the world over the last 20 some years is that they have both internal drive that's high and external drive that's high. So it's not like, oh, just flip it around and be some sort of Zen monk, only appreciating the internal motivations and drives. It's not that simple. So I think having high on both is what the big unlock is. So to do that, we often have to go back down to base level, which is like, what do you love sorting out and figuring out? And it's not like riding faster or jumping higher. It's like, what is it inside of that I love the feeling of? And what I found with most high performers is that they love the unlock. They love sorting out, like, I'm just about able to break open this new thing, this new idea, this new gear. And I'm stuck in a plateau. And when they're stuck in the plateau is where they get caught up in the low motivation to be able to stay the course. So you got to come back to home base just for a second. Like, what is the thing I love unlocking?
So what decides if somebody's in the external or internal motivation camp? If they're intrinsically or extrinsically motivated, is that an innate quality that's different in each of us depending on, genetics, upbringing, or is there a way to switch on one versus the other?
It's more of it, I think. So environment and genetics and socialization all play a factor, and culture is a big factor included in all of that. And there's regional, cultures, and there's also local cultures. So my experience has been that depending on the narrative of the street and the community that you grew up on plays a big part about what you're driven toward. And if you play a couple of scenarios out, if you're born with the silver spoon in your mouth, it's kind of a different narrative than if you were born, with very little. And I'll tell you a quick story. It was on the Founding Mastery podcast, and I had a world's best on, and I said, and I'd known him for a long time, and he played in the National Basketball Association, the NBA. I said, hey man, how are your kids? And he said, they're good. They're really good. And he's all of 6'5", 215 pounds, elite athlete in every sense of the word, won a national championship twice. And he paused and he said, I give them the best coaches. They've got the best shoes. They're in the best camps. Like, they're doing good, Mike. And he pauses and he says, but the one thing that I can't give them, the one thing I had as a kid, I can't give them. And that was nothing.
Chip
and
on
so
the
this
shoulder.
idea, yeah, that's right. And so that it's closely related to motivation, but not squarely at that conversation. So the closely part is like when your narrative from your social community or your environment is like, you got to go prove yourself. You got to go get yours. No one's going to give it to you. And then you see your parents or somebody struggling, and you see on TV or social media now with people that have so much that it contorts the internal love to unlock for the external validation, the external desire to have the thing. Now, what happens if you spend 20 plus years working at something and you're born with some genetic talents and you layer on top of it high skill, and you're chasing the external thing and you get the external thing, it's a whole different conversation. And I don't know if your community is in that conversation or there's something else happening for them.
Yeah. So when I think about the external thing, I chat with high performers in the podcast, or some of the best athletes in the world all the time, and that thing is quite tangible for them. It's like you say, it's a championship, it's a Tour de France title, it's an Olympic gold medal. When we peel it back to our everyday Joes and Janes, I call them, someone that's balancing conflicting demands on their time, work, family, maybe a side hustle, and they're still trying to prioritize health. Getting that thing, that's a little bit more of an abstract concept, because that thing is, it's health. And health, or maybe it's happiness, or maybe it's living a little bit longer. But to kind of coin Peter Attia's phrase, it's more health span and lifespan. It's living longer, but having good quality to those years as well, rather than an actual tangible destination that the elite athletes would have.
Yeah, and so the elite athletes, just to round that part of the conversation, is that they tend to have high on both external and internal. The ones that are just externally driven and low on internal, they tend not to be able to stay the course. It becomes problematic if they don't get the thing, or if they do get the thing. And what I've found is that just taking time to revisit the love of what you're trying to sort out in your life, that just spending time, even right now for us and or your community, is like, what do I love unlocking? What is the feeling that I'm looking to have more often? What is the compelling internal experience that keeps me going? And you can also have all of the external things, but you're just not in control if you actually get those external things. But you are always in control of the internal state. And I spent the last 2 years, adjacent to your question, researching what is the number one constrictor of the potential of people. What gets in the way more than just about anything else? And I'd love to talk to you about that as well. It's just adjacent, though, to motivation.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that one and come back. And I have a guess as to what I think it might be. We'll come back to that one in a second. If somebody is in that situation I've described, and they understand the beneficial habits that are going to take them to this imagined destination, this place where they're going to be happy and they're going to be healthy, what are the strategies to kickstart that? Like, what's the catalyst for motion to get them out of that rut that they're in at the moment?
Well, I want to make sure I hear you correctly, because I don't think I agree with the premise, which is that they're going to work hard and one day they're going to have happiness. Is that the framing?
Well, I suppose they're envisaging themselves in a place right now where I'm busy, I don't have time for my health pursuits, I'm making suboptimum choices around diet and sleep. And so when I say happiness, it's maybe it's a future state where they have all the things now that they aren't, when they have all the things then that they aren't currently doing now.
Yeah, I think therein lies some of the fallacy, is that later it will be better if I can just sacrifice more now. And when it comes to health, we used to believe, it was about 10 to 15 years ago, we used to believe that true high performance began where health ended. And that was a mistake. We didn't know better. We didn't know how to balance the right amount of rhythms for health versus the deep, intense, high strain work for high performance. And we thought that you couldn't have both. But now the research and science is holding up in a more interesting way to say, no, there's a better way. And so this idea that I'm going to grind now and I'll be happy later or healthy later, it just actually doesn't work that way. And so there's no substitute for grinding. There's no substitute for deep, hard, disciplined, highly intensely nauseous work to understand what you're capable of. Like, that's just part of it. But what we need is equal units of recovery on a daily basis. And those equal units of recovery is a bit esoteric. Like, for each unit of stress, you need an equal unit of recovery. And that is the right way to go after your day. If you want to play the game of potential, if you want to play the game of high performance, you need to play the right game of recovering properly to stay the course. Because high performance and potential expression takes time. and time under tension, most notably. So our days are designed with the teams I work with, or the individuals or the organizations, is to understand the units of stress, see if there's more to strain, because what ends up happening is when we're fatigued and tired because we haven't done the recovery bit quite right, we tend to hold back just a little bit. So we want to make sure that we're at the upper limit as long as we possibly can in the work that we're doing. And that work, depending on the nature of the work, is sometimes, 10 minutes to, 45 minutes, somewhere in that range. But we know that 15 minutes is a really interesting time bound for high strain, and 45 minutes is really interesting for high cognitive strain. And so what I'm saying is that we want to understand high strain, make sure we're doing that, and then equal units of recovery.
Let me take a second to talk about today's show sponsor, because I've something really exciting to share with you. It's a game changer that's been making a noticeable difference in my performance recently, especially when it comes to sleep. Allow me to introduce you to Pillar. While we're all familiar with the importance of electrolytes and carbohydrates in our race preparation, Pillar is taking a different route. It's focusing on something called micronutrition, ensuring that you're ready to perform even before you ever hit the start line. It's all about promoting a good night's sleep, facilitating effective recovery, and replenishing those crucial micronutrients so you can perform at your best. Over the past month, I've been incorporating Pillar's triple magnesium supplement into my routine. I take it every evening, about 30 minutes or so before bed, and I've seen a remarkable improvement in my sleep quality. I've been tracking my sleep with my Whoop device, and the results, they're there every morning when I wake up in black and white. I'm waking up with about a 10% improvement in my restorative sleep. I'm waking up feeling refreshed. Having had that deep restorative sleep, I'm now ready to attack work, training, and life the next day. But don't just take my word for it. Let the data from your fitness tracker tell the story. So if you're ready to elevate your performance and the quality of your sleep, why not give Pillar a try? Head over to pillarperformance.shop and use the code ROADMAN on your local website for 15% off your first order. Or for US listeners, if you head over to defeed.com/pillar and use code ROADMAN for the same 15% off your order. The details of this offer are in the description below. Now back to the show.
And recovery is not complicated. Grandma and grandpa kind of got it right. Eat food that comes from the earth, sleep about 8 hours, make sure you're laughing throughout the day and you've got some social connections and people you can pour into love, and making sure that you're hydrating on a regular basis. Like, those are kind of the big rocks of recovery. And I work my ass off to get those in, because I want to have that buoyancy in life. I want to have that zest, when I wake up in the morning, and that fire to go after the thing that I'm trying to solve. And I want that from the folks that are trusting me to help them as well.
You mentioned there's something that stops people reaching their potential. I wonder, and I know for me in the past, it has been myself. It's been that inner voice, my inner dialogue, that stood in the way of realizing my true potential.
That's it. And so if we double click on that, the reason that inner dialogue is so critical or negative or short-sighted or self-doubting, the reason we have those conversations with ourselves is because of this latent, just this very kind of invisible limit. And that invisible limit is based on survival. So our brains are optimized to scan the world and find all the things that are danger to keep us alive. And we had to scan the world to find, like, is that rustling in the bush? Is that a bunny or is that a saber tooth? And we bias towards saber tooth, because if you bias too much towards the bunny, like, game over, right? So we're biased to the alarm bells inside the fight, flight, freeze, submit mechanism. We don't talk about submit enough, but that fight, flight, freeze mechanism turns on. But in modern times, we've got this ancient kick-ass brain, but it's not optimized to modern day threats. So what's the number one threat that we have now in modern times? It's not the saber tooth anymore. It's not the dangerous dark alley that is dangerous, but it's not that uncommon, or it's not that dangerous for most folks in most communities. It's the fear of people's opinions. It's the scanning the world, your environment, and thinking like it's this exhaustive attempt to try to interpret what they're thinking. Because if you are rejected, then, and you are kicked out of the tribe long ago, hundreds and thousands of years ago, long ago, that meant certain death. And so it's not the actual negative opinion that's so problematic. It's the fear of that opinion. And it's this, again, this exhaustive attempt to preempt a negative opinion by interpreting clues in our environment to see if we're okay. And
so what are the strategies for changing that inner dialogue?
Well, first, it's recognizing that we often find ourselves conforming or contorting or like shape-shifting our true self to be approved by others. And so that's one level to pay attention to. The second is when you are aware of this compromised way of contorting yourself or conforming for social approval in very subtle ways. That's part one. Part two is to become more aware of the way that you, excuse the locker room language here, the way that you talk shit to yourself, the way that you coach yourself in an absolute like amateur way, is you need to become aware of that as well. So the first seat of this whole thing, the first pillar is awareness. And if you're not investing, this is a big statement I'm going to make, but if you're not doing something in your life to invest in awareness training, you're not really in the game. You're a grinder. You're getting after it, but you're not really in the game of the potential that you have dormant lying within you. And so you end up, let's go back to recovery. If you're not aware of how your inner self is working, you end up burning a lot of internal resources. A, to make sure that you are doing what you can to be accepted and not rejected. And B, to be aware of that critical, negative, debilitating narrative. Awareness is required for both of those. And so kind of the whole thing starts with awareness training. And then you start to get more sophisticated on how, I'll tie this thing full circle. The things that you love and the feeling that you're trying to, let me be more precise. It's not the things you love. That is not what motivation's about. It's about having the feeling, the internal experience where you feel most alive. And it's not having an external event dictate or cause that internal feeling. True mastery is being able to have that feeling wherever you go, or I should say those feelings wherever you go. So it's awareness first, and then it's knowing kind of the way you want to live your life from the inside out. And then it's practicing ways of thinking that way and ways of being authentic to your actual values rather than being liked by other people.
Whenever I've had a goal in my crosshairs, and I'll specify on this is an external goal, something that's objectively measurable, to win a bike race, to podium in a national championships. Whenever I've had this goal and I set about, in cycling circles, we'll reverse engineer the demands of the goal and we'll build out a periodized training plan around that. But I found that my motivation ebbs and flows within that training cycle. It could be, a 6-month training cycle. We'll have natural recovery rhythms built into that based on performance and data metrics. But my motivation won't naturally ebb and flow in harmony with my physical training load. Like I could be expected to complete quite a difficult, arduous training week, but I'm on a very low ebb on motivation. How can we deal with those natural ebbs and flows in motivation?
So I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're saying when you're in a when you're in a training cycle, there's ebbs and flows in motivation.
Yeah,
is that right?
Training cycle, dietary goal, even a work target that I have. I'll find myself with periods where I'm like getting after it, everything's lined up, but then something will come along and it'll slightly derail me, and I won't be able to like snap back out of it. And I'm going to have to surf this low until I get back to that next high again.
Yeah. So we're talking about like increase. So that happens to everybody, getting knocked off the perch or knocked off the whatever, like that does happen. So I think what we're talking about is increasing the speed of getting back after it. Right. And that
Yeah, I think it's two things. It's increasing the speed. It's making, I suppose, to use the wave analogy, it's to make higher lows. So the low isn't as, if I think about some of the clients I'm working with, so one in particular, he'll have a training week where he'll go basically to 0 training hours. And he'll say, work's too busy, family's too busy. I got 0 training hours in. I'm trying to say, okay, well, instead of 0, can we make that 4? Can we make that 5 hours?
Yeah, I think you probably know the answer here, which is habits. And so, and this ties back into recovery. And so it's both habits and recovery. If you're tilling the soil and you're creating an environment where, it's fertile for growth, things happen, and it's easier for things to grow. That's what recovery is. The basic practice of recovery is having fertile soil, so that when you apply sun and stress and pressure or wind or rain or whatever to the seed, it grows. And it's the same thing in sport. So mechanically, it's making sure recovery is in place. And there's 2 ways to think about recovery. One is a mistake and one is like more advantageous. The mistake is I'll recover later. I'll take the 2-week vacation. I'll take the month vacation. I'll recover better after I get through this training cycle. It doesn't work. It's not how we're designed. So the more optimal way to do it is what we refer to as thin slicing of recovery. So being great every day with thin slices. It's like you could sit on a pillow and do meditation for 20 minutes. Good science. It's been around 2,600 years. I've been practicing for 25 years myself. However, 100 long exhales spread out throughout the day in chunks of 2s and 3s is really important. It's different than meditation, but it's a really important thin slice of recovery. So the first,
that's really interesting. I like that. Just to jump in there, sorry to interrupt you. That's really interesting because that's something I'm really passionate about. And you see this all the time in modern culture. When someone does come off the wagon, you hear this mantra, oh, well, I may as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. So this could be someone who's trying to give up drink and then they have 1 glass of wine. And their rationale is, well, if I have 1 glass of wine, sure, I may as well have a whole bottle. But what you're really advocating here, and quite elegantly, is instead of all or nothing, maybe just do all or something.
Yeah, right. I mean, basically, and there's different benefits of both, right? The basic thing I'm trying to just put a stake in the ground is to say, make sure your recovery is on point. Okay. And then that allows that 4-hour, like I want to get after it for 4 hours as a minimum threshold, but instead I'm choosing 0 hours to your analogy. Is when the fertile is ripe and like you're taking care of yourself, 4 is more doable. If you're exhausted and the soil is hardened and you haven't been watering it properly, 0 might be the best call actually, because you haven't been taking care of yourself, and that's where things break. And that's where burnout happens. And if it is one more level or layer to this complicated conversation, is maybe you're not prioritizing what you want in the long term over what you need in the short term. And so prioritization is really important as well. One of the things that best in the world do is that they tend to have a pretty singular focus. And that singular focus is very clear. Those goals are very clear. Like, I'm going after X. And again, that can be internal and or external. And not a whole lot of other stuff competes with it. And sometimes, unfortunately, including family, including social life, including other things. So maybe for the working person, we need to readjust the kind of the ambition for the long term. Are we going for health or are we going for records?
And setting that goal it's an interesting conversation in itself, because, the professional athletes, it's one thing. The goals, in a lot of ways, they pick themselves. They're the big shiny objects that are within reach, but they're more difficult for a lot of us. And for me personally, I found that in cycle anyway, we take a winter break. So we'll race all the way up through the summer, and you'll normally take like 2-3 weeks total off the bike. So you'll lock it away until the point where you're just dying to get out cycling again. And when I'm getting back into it, when I'm setting goals, I found for a long time, I set these lofty goals. Okay, I'm going to get back into it this week, back to 3 times a week in the gym, back to riding the bike 20 hours. And the lofty goal didn't work for me. It was nice to have a North Star goal. Yes, I want a podium in national championships. I want a podium in this race. To set it and then put it away. But then practically to make much smaller goals. Because when the threshold for action was so big, it was just like, oh, that's so big, it's so scary, and it's so far away. I'm just going to do nothing. But when the goal was absolutely minuscule, like my goal today is to find my shoes for tomorrow. The threshold for taking action is so easy that I almost can't fail on that. What's the theory behind setting big goals or setting small goals, or how should we balance those two?
So I'm much more, I love what you're doing, because what the small goals that you're talking about is habit formation, is setting something that eventually becomes a habit in many respects. And when you achieve those seemingly small goals, you'd want to pair that with being really excited about achieving it. So you want to have your back, you want to kind of celebrate like a wild person, like nobody else would understand. But what that does,
my shoes.
Yeah, right. But what that does is it pairs like this foot in the door, this momentum. It pairs that momentum towards the next thing with enjoyment and fun and excitement and dopamine in particular. So like you want to try to be clever with your neurochemistry, your psychology, and your behaviors. And if you get all three of those working in favor, great. And so the small little goals there is interesting because they start to turn into habits because our body wants to do stuff that is associated with pleasure and some sort of reward. So you can artificially create that reward by the celebration I'm talking about. I'm much more interested in goals that are 100% under my control. And that the art of knowing how to set a goal that's 100% your responsibility and 100% in your control is a very important part of the art of the science of goal setting. So goals that serve with more potency and power are ones that are 100% under our control.
Interesting. So if I am looking to get started now, I'm a listener on this podcast, I finished this podcast, and I want to take one positive action towards achieving this idea of consistent motivation, what would be that first step you would take?
Okay. First step is to be very clear about the feelings that you want to have more often in your life. Okay. So if it's specific to cycling, what is the feeling I want to associate that activity with? And so I'll tell you why that's so important is because it is psychological and emotional first, and psychology and emotion drive behavior. So if you put behavior ahead of psychology and emotion, you end up diluting the potency. So what is the feeling? So now you're shaping the bullseye. And then from that, you line up small behaviors that will help you be more aligned with those feelings.
The vocabulary around the feeling's hard though, isn't it? Like, what is the feeling for someone trying to get in shape? Is it a feeling of freshness? Is it a feeling of freedom, effortless on the bike or the run? Like it is a difficult vocabulary for someone that's not used to expressing a goal through a feeling.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that we are pretty average when it comes to understanding how to work with emotions. And I say that like I work in some of the most alpha competitive environments in the world and pretty freaking average. And so if intellectually, if you say, yeah, no, I am a thinker and a doer, and there's no room for emotions, like intellectually, it's hard to make that logic in that statement. So most people would say, yeah, being human is about having emotions, about having thoughts, and about having behaviors. There's something about those three that's really important. And they're so difficult to deal with. Emotions and feelings actually are separate constructs, but they're so difficult to manage or deal with that we just try to numb them down or put them aside. And what I'm suggesting is the greatest driver and motivator is to be able to work well with your emotions. And that starts with first identifying the feelings that you want to have. So to be really concrete, when I'm looking for unlocking concepts and ideas that are new to me and fresh, and there's a thrill with that. I'm dedicating my life to mastery of the psychology of high performance. And so when I can see and hear and feel something that is new, it's exhilarating. It's wonderful. And so I want to be clear that that's why I'm grinding. It's not for money. It's not for, I need money. I'm not independently wealthy. It's not for attention. While that can feel nice when you're recognized for something that seems clever or smart or important or meaningful, but it's like, I need to be responsible for my life, and my life, the way I want to feel when something unlocks with another person, that's the feeling that I'm looking for, which for each person, I think it's important to recognize that. And then I'll anchor this one more time with you, Anthony. This comes from the work of Dr. Newberg. It's called the resonance model. And so the idea is you start with this dream about how you want to live your life, the feelings that come with it. You start with the dream. And then you figure out, like, kind of, you go to, that's 12 o'clock on a clock. And then you move to 3 o'clock. And it's like, okay, how am I going to prepare and train? And what are the capabilities I need to be able to develop? Okay, so that's a preparation phase. Then you swing down to 6 o'clock and you're going to have some success. You're going to have some obstacles. You're going to have some setbacks, SOS, setbacks, obstacles, and successes. And what most people do is they go, right, I need to prepare. Good, I'm glad I had this setback or obstacle or success. Now what do I do? Let me go prepare differently. And they swing back up to 3 o'clock. And then they train again and they swing back down to 6 o'clock. They need to reach another success or obstacle or setback. And they just find themselves in that grind between 3 and 6 o'clock. And that is exhausting. It's a plan for staleness and burnout and fatigue. It's the dull part of life, right? And so what Dr. Newberg found is that the extraordinaries, when they hit a setback, obstacle, or success, they revisit the dream. Swing over to 9 o'clock now. They revisit the dream. And that's all I'm suggesting in this conversation is go back and revisit, like, what is the feeling that you want to have more often in your life? And then design your life for that. Think that way, have conversations with yourself that support that, be in relationships with other people, set up your recovery and training program to have those types of feelings more often. And I'm not suggesting by any means to have one feeling, joy or happiness or fun. I want the full range. I want to understand the depth and the range of the human experience, and that squarely sits in emotional frameworks, not physical. Like it's just not, and it's not psychological alone. It squarely sits in the emotional part of being human. And if you go to any of the great wisdoms, they will point to the same thing, and so does modern science in a lot of ways.
I think that's a lovely place to wrap up. Michael, I love that finishing clock analogy. Dr. Michael Gervais, thank you for joining me on the Roadmat Podcast.
Appreciate you.
If you enjoyed that episode, please press here for another conversation that I know you're going to love. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your club mates.